All right, and we're back. So, the team has chosen a vendor or vendors that provide the best services for the best value and meet the municipality's needs. So, now what? Time to get the contract in order and present your team's recommendation to the governing board. So negotiation is both the most fun and most challenging part of the procurement process. It's fun because you get to communicate with vendors in different sectors, and they often teach you a lot about what they do. I know more about helicopter maintenance than I'd ever thought possible, and it's because it took me 6 months to negotiate a contract with Bell to fix our turbines, but that's a story for another day. Mostly, negotiation is challenging because you are responsible for protecting the city's interests and risk, but the vendor is trying to do the same thing for their company. You have to be transparent, stay on task, and timely, and you also have to incorporate project-specific items and terms and assess each part of the contract for whether it's relevant to the service and the vendor selected, which can be time-consuming. It's even hard to say. Often, you have to rope in your attorneys because there are contract terms that are so opaque that even the most experienced procurement officer doesn't really know what a proposed change from a company might mean to the contract itself. Though you want to make sure the government is getting everything it needs and wants in a negotiation, it's also important to agree to things quickly. The more time it takes, the more money the government is spending on you and your attorney's time. The more invested you get in the process, the harder that negotiation is to call off. And the harder it is to call off, the more likely you are to agree to things that you shouldn't. Most importantly, keep your eye on the forest, not the trees, because at the end of the day, the vendor is still going to be a partner to the jurisdiction, so you have to keep the relationship very civil. I think some of these tidbits are in your book, but I've added some of my own as well. First, make sure you're negotiating with someone that either has the authority or has a direct line to someone with authority to negotiate the contract. If you aren't, it will take twice as long to negotiate. Second, negotiate the high priorities first. Allow some wins, even in those big ones, if you can, because then the vendor will be more likely to agree to things later. If you haven't already notified the vendor that they're your top choice for the contract, you can also use the other vendors in the mix as a bargaining chip, because there's always a threat that the jurisdiction will go with vendor B if the negotiations fall apart. This also works if you're going to award to multiple vendors. Most important, make sure to put everything in writing. You can discuss things over the phone, but make sure that you follow up with an email covering what you agreed to. I guess it's also important to get to a win-win, but that's not always possible, so at least try to keep in mind that they'll be working with the city for a while, and again, will be one of your partners. Now that I've written this slide, I can see how some of these things might seem really harsh and conniving, but remember, your job as a negotiator is to protect your employer's interest. All right, so depending on how your jurisdiction or which jurisdiction you work for and how it operates, you may be required to get approval from your governing board, such as the City Council or the Board of County Commissioners, for the vendor selection you and your evaluation team have made. This is normally dependent on the anticipated total cost of the service, so if it is over a certain amount, the board will have to approve it. This varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, though. The city requires council approval for all service technology and goods contracts over $100,000, but the county only requires this on commodities and technology. So services don't require approval, so it really just depends on where you work. In both places, we're allowed to start the negotiation process before the board approves, but we can't finalize a document and get it signed until after the board approves. So you can kind of start the process, but you can't finish it until after board approval. In other jurisdictions, you can't do anything other than make a recommendation to the governing board, and once they approve, only then can you move forward with the negotiation phase. The reason they do this is that if the board doesn't approve the contract, you may have to go to Plan B, the next vendor down the list. As you present your selected vendor to the governing board, make sure that you have a handle on the political climate of the board. Are there some members that will dispute any contract that isn't awarded to a woman-owned business? Are some really sensitive to how much money is being spent on road repairs, for example? Timing can also be important, both helpful and harmful. You have to plan enough time to get to the board's approval, but also build in time in case they don't approve your suggestion. Sometimes the other items on a board's agenda that night can on the night that your item is being approved can help affect your chances of approval. If the agenda is really busy, your item may get overlooked when normally there would be questions. If the agenda has some other similar items to what you're trying to get approved, there may be questions about why you didn't work with the departments that are also getting their items approved. That's actually happened quite a bit recently. Presenting to the governing board can be very intimidating because it's a very public forum, but my suggestions are just to be clear and concise, don't give them more information than they need, and stand behind your decisions. If you can keep a cool head, your contract will get approved. All right, so our special topic this week is utilities contracting. There is one interview uploaded to Moodle with Adrienne Lewis. She is the Service Technology and Commodities Procurement Manager for Charlotte Water, formerly known as Charlotte-Mecklenburg Utilities Department, or CMUD. She and I have a very similar position, but she focuses just on utilities procurement. Feel free to pause this now and open and read her interview to get a background on utilities contracting before we jump into the rest of this. All right. So before I worked for the city, I thought utilities referred to electrical lines buried in the ground and like TV cable infrastructure. But so you can imagine how surprised I was when I learned that in the local government world, utilities basically just refers to water. And by water, I mean drinking and wastewater and the infrastructure needed to get it from place to place. Towns get water from a reservoir, river, or other source, purify it at a water treatment plant, and then send it out into the community for people to drink and put on their lawns. When you flush the toilet or brush your teeth, the water then flows to a wastewater treatment plant for cleansing before sending it back to the original water source so that downstream consumers can use it. I heard a statistic once about the Catawba River, where Charlotte gets its water, that any given molecule of water from the river has been used 13 times before it empties into the ocean. Don't think about that too much. Like transportation contracting, the services provided by utilities departments don't just serve citizens. They also serve businesses, visitors, and often neighboring municipalities. Water is a regional need, not something specific to one town or another. In Orange County, North Carolina, they have a special water authority, which is called OWASA, which stands for the Orange Water and Sewer Authority. Their headquarters and water treatment are located in Chapel Hill, but it serves residents across the county. Another really unique customer in the utilities world is someone we may never see, the downstream water users. On the water treatment side of utilities, you can see most of your stakeholders every day, and they can complain to you if they need to. The people that are actually using the water that comes out of the tap in your jurisdiction. But for the wastewater stakeholders, the people downstream, you may never see them. Not only do you not want to send not only do you not want to send a bad product down the stream because it could be harmful for them, you also want to be conscious of how much water you send to them, and not to mention the effect on the quality of the water for fish and wildlife in the streams. So what do utilities procurement officers buy that might be different than general procurements? First, they often have to be very well versed in construction, both of the very unique buildings that are the water and wastewater treatment plants, but also the underground water infrastructure. These are incredibly delicate projects with a lot of state and federal guidelines. Now, I'm not saying that if you work in utilities procurement, you have to become a civil engineer overnight, but it does help to have at least a basic understanding of what's needed. The actual technical specifications of the buildings and pipes get designed by the vendor, but the engineers and the procurement officer have to be able to frame the needs in such a way that vendors' proposals can be evaluated properly. Chemicals purchases are also a huge part of utilities contracting. These are interesting because their cost fluctuates a lot throughout the year based on the various commodities markets. You also have to buy, store, and disseminate the various plants sufficient amounts of the chemicals, which can be tough because you have to kind of balance nonstop. All right, another big thing that's unique about utilities procurement is that unlike most procurement activities that are paid for through the jurisdiction's general fund, or basically, the sales and property taxes, utilities purchases are paid through an enterprise fund. For those that haven't taken budgeting yet, an enterprise fund is when users of a service or good provided by the government pay into a fund. Airports often have enterprise funds made up of the rents paid by airlines. Restaurants and shops in the terminal. For utilities, both businesses and residents in an area pay water fees for how much they use each month, and those fees are often collected in the utilities enterprise fund. This can be a challenge because in times of drought, we encourage water users to conserve water by not watering their lawns or washing their cars, but you can see how that can be a problem. If we're telling you to conserve water, you're also not paying so much for your water, so the enterprise fund can dip really low. I once heard a Charlotte Water employee refer to this as not being able to sell their product, and that the enterprise fund levels often mirror the water tables levels in a jurisdiction in times of drought, because if you don't have any water, you also don't get paid for producing water. So operating under an enterprise fund can be advantageous in tough economic times for a jurisdiction, because if the city itself has a general fund budget shortfall, this won't really affect the utilities department because they get their money from fees and not property or sales taxes. Whoop. Sorry, hope that didn't go away on you. In summary, utilities contracting is challenging because there are a lot of needs that are urgent, like needing an immediate supply of goods and services to respond to a water main leak or water treatment plant malfunction, and a lot of procurement is out of your control because it's so crucial to the well-being of the community. You also have a lot of stakeholders, so you can't just hire any contractor off the street, because that contractor will be on people's property and responsible for very sensitive projects. Another challenge is the security required of utilities facilities and infrastructure. Each facility requires sophisticated security technology like cameras, command centers, and alarms because of the public health threat if water is contaminated. So procurement officers have to stay abreast of the current trends in physical and network security. But the good thing about utilities procurement is that for the most part, it's pretty predictable and consistent. You'll know when facilities need upgrading, how many chemicals to buy, etc., because you bought them last year, and you'll know what they need next year. There are emergencies occasionally you can't plan for, but you should be pretty ready to deal with them. And of course, it's nice to know that buying the right chemicals and maintaining well-performing facilities means that you're sending high-quality water back into the river or lake for downstream users. So that is the end of week 7. Make sure to go out and do your activities for the week and your assignment for your project.